Welcome everyone for part two as we continue our discussion with Malcolm Harkins regarding solar winds and SEC regulations. So I guess you can always correct the message and deliver it the way, but I see your point. So when you start massaging it to the point that nobody recognizes what the message is coming, that's where things have tendency to start slipping in the direction that nobody wants them to slip in once they get
No,
this.
you're totally right. Yeah, you're totally right. Years ago, I had done a speech around the perspective of risk, and I used a camera analogy, right? So you think of a camera, it got lens. You can do super zoom and
Mm.
get really, really tight and really focused. You can do wide angle. You can play with contrast and coloring and all these things that are like the apertures of things. And if you think of that, that's what we also have to constantly do to make sure we reduce the biased perspectives that sometimes get introduced to risk. Because risk sometimes is in the eye of the beholder, right? Because I have a different angle of view. I think of like, executive management, CISO, all these things. If you think of as we are taking our perspective on risk, there's this prism and you're shining you're putting light through it and it reflects and refracts differently. You get different hues and you get different perspectives depending upon your angle of view. If I'm the CFO, I'm the general counsel, I'm a business unit general manager, I'm a boot on the ground. That boot on the ground is like a super zoom lens, right? Which could cause you to overcharacterize sometimes the perspective of risk because you're at that very detailed pixelated level. But when you zoom out, that blade of grass, yeah, there might be a little bit of a weed there, but in the whole entirety of the company, you know, you've got this nice rolling field. But the question becomes, is that thing in that blade of grass potentially so lethal and so diddly that it could cause a material impact and affect the entire field or not? And so that's where you have to have this, collection of differing perspectives. And the CISO has to be, in many ways, the arbiter of that to bring a level of objectivity, not to overcharacterize risk and sometimes take the input from their teams and their people that are at a detailed level and really bring it into that broader perspective. But it's a challenge, but it's, I think, part of the role, and many people do it exceptionally well. But I think, again, with the scrutiny now, the requirements now, the impact that shareholders, impact the society has seen with cyber risk growing year on year on year, we've got to do a better job. And that's not only the CISO, but hell, that's the CIO, that's the CTO, that's the people who are creating technology. That's why I'm also very supportive of what the administration has proposed in some of their stuff to, again, create more economic liability on the creators of technology in addition to the operators of technology, because we've got to change the economics of this so that the people who are responsible for controlling for risk feel that accountability more. I believe that. Having grown up in the tech industry, I've always believed that. And which is why it's a shame that the enforcement actions are affecting a few now, but it's I think necessary. And I think the other thing that's frankly the real crime is some of those enforcement actions didn't affect other executives in organizations, because I don't think the CISO should be the only one holding the bag, in these organizations.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Malcolm. I totally agree with that because it seems like in some cases, organization just found a scapegoat to pin the sort of tell them dumb and said, okay, here's the guy that whoever holds the job is going to be responsible for all the misstatements and all the material to impact that organization has suffered. But from perspective of what we just said and how everything is changing, how do you see? And one question I was thinking, because in the past, when you look at the CISO role, it was not it did not have extremely high, I would say, risk than carried. So a lot of jobs that they carry high risk, they usually have a different compensation level and so on. And CISO role was growing up in responsibility and accountability, and now we have this sort of axe hanging over our heads to say, yes, you have to do all those things. How do you see organization would be responding and changing compensation levels or bringing them to where they need to be based on other rules within the organization that have similar responsibilities, accountability, and the responsibility for the risk and success of the organization. So do you see this changing, or are we gonna continue being the status quo sort of?
Well, I would actually argue that not in all cases, but if you look in aggregate, many CISO roles are very highly compensated. Certainly, there's some very, very high compensated CISOs that are making millions of dollars a year, right? Commensurate with other corporate officers and other executives. In other organizations, you've got CISOs that are making, low six figures, 150, 170, 200 grand a year. And they're reporting to a CIO who's making 700 grand a year, right? Well, okay, well, that may be appropriate. But the question just becomes one of if they're a peer of the CIO or another executive, you earn that compensation. The title itself is and the role might deserve it, but the question becomes, do you deserve it? Are you truly an executive that deserves executive level pay? You may or you may not be. Don't just think because you've been given a title that became nomenclature in the industry, CISO, that you're an executive. You might not be. And frankly, that's the case with some of the people in the role. In other cases, there are people in the role that have been highly compensated and they have the title. And, they frankly are not a business leader. They just happen to be a security executive. I know if I was CEO of a company, I'd want my CISO to not only be a security executive, but I'd want them to be a business executive leader in my organization. And if they weren't, they wouldn't be an executive. And I'd probably make them an InfoSec director. And depending upon the organization, they might report, into a variety of other corporate officers that had that business acumen and executive acumen capabilities in addition to that knowledge with which they possess. So we also have to look at our own development and say, do we deserve that level of compensation? We might not, regardless of whether or not there's a liability that exists.
Got it, got it. Thank you for that. So from your perspective, again, I'm trying to wrap it up and see what CISOs should be focused on and going forward, having all those things happening. And how would you define the most important thing that they say, hey, I need to do this and I need to make sure that my voice is heard and I need to make sure that I communicate properly or do risk assessments, and if company doesn't agree, I need to have a good paper trail or good trail of documentation. So when something like this happens, at least you have defensible position that you made all the issues known and the organization didn't take any. So what would be your take? And actually, one thing that I want to add, if you can sort of talk about this 4 days notification period that executive order came down, and so we need to know about all those cyber incidents happening. Probably something not very realistic for most organization to figure it out in 4 days what is going on and provide the report until you certainly know what you want to report on. And again, I think from your perspective, and in many ways they're similar as mine, looking at the organization out there, a lot of them don't have all their ducks in a row, and some of them probably still looking for their ducks, not to mention that having them in a row. So, what is your take? What do you think, or what would you suggest CISOs to kind of realign themselves? Because you cannot eat everything at the same time, so you need to have this chunks and start working on them, and then you move yourself forward.
Yeah. So number one for me, again, I'll go back to my Intel days. 22 years ago, when I landed in the security space in Intel IT, the design goal that I had was no material significant events. Still, my primary design goal anytime I've taken a role. So again, I would say, what's your design goal? And saying you're hitting a certain level of maturity on some maturity score, or you've hit certain compliance stuff, that's a means to an end. That is not a design goal. So figure out your design goal. Company says we're fine with 5 material events a year. Great. What are those? Document them. And the ones that they're not good with, focus on that. Right. So, one, you got to understand what's material. Two, you got to have a design goal for what you're trying to achieve, and just saying you're hitting a certain maturity or compliance item is not a real goal, right? In my mind, it's a tactic or strategy to achieve a goal. Two, you know, if you feel shut off from your executives, go find an ally, go talk to internal audit, go talk to the general counsel, go talk to the CFO, and if necessary, go have a private dialogue with a board member and tell them your concerns. But walk the chain of command. Don't just sit there and say, I'm blocked. If you got a CIO, a CTO, a business unit general manager blocking you, frankly, go through them, go around them. Risk management, unfortunately, is a contact sport. I can be, to some extent, a little bit assertive, and I'll play it like hockey. And yes, I will sometimes check people into the glass, like hockey players do. I try not to use my stick in a sportsman-like fashion, but you got to have contact, otherwise you're not going to push through it. Third, just keep your integrity intact. If you're overruled, that's fine. I get overruled all the time, but make your case known, document that you were overruled, and stay true to your perspectives. And again, if the risk is not material, don't fight that battle. It's an acceptable risk. But if it is material and people are wanting to change your perspectives on your assessments, don't do it without good logic and good data that changes your opinion. And then you reframe it with that new knowledge. And then third, yeah, you should go understand what your legal risk is. You should ask for D&O insurance, director and officer insurance. If you don't get it, well, then you have to do a better job of making sure who's then accountable and documenting that, so you can absolve yourself of some potential litigation. But that's, again, not even if you have D&O, as I mentioned before, it's not going to negate a potential criminal proceeding against you if you've done something wrong. And seek counsel internally, and ideally have somebody that's a cybersecurity and privacy legal expert either in your organization who can provide you that counsel, or seek outside counsel as an additional layer beyond what your internal counsel provides. I've done that in every role that I've had. It's helped me. It's learned things. It's helped me figure out how to protect myself, protect the company, protect shareholders, and protect customers.
Great. Thank you, Malcolm. Certainly appreciate having you on the talk, and your guidance is always helpful. And I'm sure the audience will reflect on that and have the same. So, with that said, I think that's pretty much was my last question for the show. And unless you have something else to add, feel free. And other than that, we're gonna wrap it up.
And the only thing I would leave people with is, difficult conversations are difficult, but you need to have them versus avoid them. Because when you avoid them, I think it always creates, again, the situation, the environment that will put not only your company, but perhaps yourself in jeopardy.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it, and thank you for coming on, and for the audience, thank you for joining in, and we're stronger together. So keep tuning in, and as we continue to work on different issues. Thank you. Until next time.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.